The sun had barely risen as Emma stood by the kitchen counter, the hum of the coffee machine filling the otherwise quiet morning. The gentle scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft rustling of the leaves outside the window. She gazed out at the garden, lost in thought. She had always found peace in the simplicity of mornings like this, her small sanctuary of calm before the world outside rushed in. Emma and James had been married for 7 years, a partnership that had begun with passion and promise. They met in college, bonding over late-night talks about dreams and aspirations, their connection almost electric. Their wedding, just a few years later, was small but perfect, surrounded by family and friends who cheered for the couple they all believed would last forever. And for a time, it did. They built a life together, a home, a family, even a dog they named Max. But lately, things had shifted. Unspoken tension had crept into their relationship, invisible yet undeniable. Emma had tried to dismiss it at first, blaming the stress of work and life. James had become more distant, less affectionate, but it was easy to ignore. After all, everyone had their bad days, and yet there was something about him that felt different, like he was no longer fully present in their shared world. She couldn't put her finger on it, but Emma felt the space between them growing with each passing day. That morning, Emma went about her routine with an absent sense of calm. The tasks felt automatic, pouring her coffee into a mug, spreading butter on toast, checking her phone for any messages from work. It was also ordinary, and as much as she longed for something extraordinary, she had learned to accept that maybe life wasn't meant to be an endless adventure. Maybe it was supposed to be simple, or so she tried to convince herself. James had already left for work, the car keys jangling on the hook by the door as he hurried out, his usual brief kiss on the cheek barely registering. Emma didn't mind. She understood the rush. Their lives had become a routine of work, chores, and obligatory smiles. No complaints, no drama. At least that's what she kept telling herself. But today was different. As Emma was tidying up the living room later that afternoon, her eyes fell on a small detail in James's car, which she had parked in the driveway. It was a small thing, something that didn't belong. As she gathered the trash and reached into the passenger seat to toss an empty coffee cup, something caught her eye. A watch. It wasn't hers. The watch was delicate, a silver band gleaming softly in the muted daylight, with a rose-gold face that seemed to shimmer even in the shadows. It was clearly expensive. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, turning it over in her hand. There was no mistaking it. This was not a watch that belonged to her. She stared at the watch for a long moment, her mind racing. It wasn't just any watch. It was a woman's watch, fine, elegant, and a stark contrast to the cheap, functional style of the one Emma wore. But that wasn't the most troubling thing. What disturbed her the most was the unmistakable sense of familiarity she felt when holding it. It wasn't just any stranger's accessory. It felt like it had belonged in his life for longer than she could comprehend. Was this the mark of another woman? The thought had crossed her mind before. Subtle signs, offhand comments, strange absences. Yet she had dismissed it, too afraid of the possibility. But now, here it was, in her husband's car. The reality of the moment hit her like a ton of bricks. Her fingers tightened around the watch, but the weight of it was far too much for her to bear. The room around her seemed to close in as her chest tightened with anxiety. She had to sit down, her legs nearly giving way beneath her. Was this what it had all been leading to? She thought. The subtle changes, the distance, the late nights. Her mind flashed back to those small moments that now seemed like whispers of warning. The way James had grown quieter over the last few months, the secretive phone calls that always ended abruptly when she entered the room. She'd wondered before if something was wrong, but had pushed those thoughts away, telling herself that it was all in her head. And now, this. Emma tried to steady her breath, her hands shaking as she clutched the watch. She was no longer sure what to believe. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. Had he been seeing someone? The idea felt too surreal to process. She had seen them through so many challenges. Life had tested them, yes, but they had always come out stronger, or so she thought. She needed answers. She couldn't just sit here, pretending everything was fine. She needed to confront him, to face the truth. The watch lay heavy in her palm, the quiet ticking seeming to grow louder in the stillness. How had he let this happen? She wondered. How had they gotten here? The tension between them had been building for months, creeping like a slow tide, rising and rising until now, when the wave had finally crashed. She felt as if she had been standing on the edge of a cliff for so long, not knowing when she would fall, and now she had. What was she supposed to do? The answer seemed simple, yet impossible. There was no going back. Emma's chest ached as the realization settled in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. She wasn't crazy. There was no other woman's watch, no other woman's love, without there being something real between them. The watch sat on the kitchen counter, a cruel reminder of everything Emma had hoped to ignore. It gleamed in the morning sunlight, almost mocking her as it ticked away the seconds. She had been staring at it for what felt like hours, but it was only minutes. Her mind couldn't grasp what had happened. She had found it. She had actually found it. There was no denying it. In her head, the possibilities swirled. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a gift for someone else. Maybe there was an explanation, a perfectly logical reason why her husband, James, the man she had spent the last 7 years of her life with, had a woman's watch in his car. But none of the rationalizations made sense. She could feel the sharp edge of betrayal cutting through her chest. Her breath quickened, and her heart pounded as a heavy sense of dread filled her. Could this be the end of everything? Or was it something she was overreacting to? Emma stood there in the kitchen, the watch still in her hand, trembling. It felt as if the walls of her once safe world were closing in on her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Why was she even questioning herself? She had seen the watch. She had touched it. She had held proof of his betrayal in her hands. And yet, something inside her refused to fully believe it. Her thoughts turned to the nights James had come home late, the strange conversations that ended abruptly when she walked into the room, his distracted gaze when he had looked at her over the dinner table. The signs had been there all along, hadn't they? She had been too afraid to face them, too busy convincing herself that their life was solid, that everything was just a phase. Was she really that naive? She sank into a chair, her hands shaking violently, as she set the watch down on the table. It was as if it had grown too heavy, too real. The reality of the situation clawed at her. Was she going to confront him now? Was she going to demand answers right away? Her stomach twisted into knots at the thought. No, she couldn't do that. Not yet. Maybe there was more to this story, she told herself. Maybe she was just jumping to conclusions. Maybe he had a perfectly innocent explanation for this. But deep down, Emma knew. The doubt she had been pushing aside for so long had finally come crashing down on her, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Later that afternoon, Emma reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over her best friend Katie's name. Katie had been by her side through every major moment of her life. Graduation, weddings, even through the more trivial, but equally significant, moments of day-to-day life. Emma needed advice, but was she ready to hear it? She dialed the number, the phone ringing for what felt like an eternity before Katie answered. "Hey, Em. What's up?" Katie's voice was casual, but there was an undertone of concern. "I need to talk. Can I come over?" Emma replied, her voice tight with emotion. The moment Katie answered the door, she could see something was wrong. Emma was pale, her eyes swollen from what looked like hours of staring into a void. "Come inside," Katie said softly, guiding her into the living room. They sat down on the couch, Emma's hands ringing nervously in her lap. "What happened? You're scaring me." Katie's brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of Emma's silence. Emma hesitated for a moment before speaking, but the words tumbled out in a rush. "I found something today. Something in James's car. I don't know what to make of it." Katie's eyes widened in concern. "What did you find?" Emma swallowed hard. "A watch. A woman's watch. Not mine." Katie's face softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry. But are you sure? Have you asked him about it?" "I haven't," Emma admitted. "I don't know if I should. I keep thinking, what if I'm just overreacting? What if it's not what I think it is?" Katie paused, her gaze lingering on Emma's face. "Sweetie, it's okay to be upset. But don't jump to conclusions. If you've been feeling something's off, trust your instincts." Emma nodded slowly, but she could feel her stomach churning with uncertainty. What if Katie was right? What if she was just seeing things that weren't there? Over the next few days, Emma found herself consumed with the thought of the watch. It lingered in her mind constantly, like an echo she couldn't silence. She became hyper-aware of everything James did, his small, nervous habits, the way he avoided eye contact when she spoke to him. The more she thought about it, the more she noticed. The more she noticed, the more questions she had. James was being careful, too careful. He'd been coming home later than usual, even taking work calls late at night, which had never been his habit before. He hadn't said much to her in the past week, his responses clipped, his attention always somewhere else. She could feel the growing distance between them, like an invisible wall building with every passing day. Her mind raced as she tried to piece it all together. What was she supposed to believe? What if she was just making assumptions, pushing herself further into a spiral of doubt? But when she thought about the watch again, the sinking feeling in her chest returned. Could this really be a mistake? But then again, what if it wasn't? Days passed, and Emma's mind remained consumed with questions that she couldn't answer. There was no clarity, only confusion and pain. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that she could not ignore it. She needed answers. She had to confront James. But how would she do that? What if he denied everything? What if he lied? The possibility of facing the truth terrified her. What would she do if he confessed? What if he didn't? Her emotions were a constant whirlwind. Anger, sadness, frustration, all mixing together. She was exhausted, but her thoughts wouldn't stop. She couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the crushing weight of the betrayal she felt was hanging over her. It was clear now. She would have to face him. The question was, could she handle what he might say? In this section, Emma's emotional and psychological state unravels as she is consumed by the discovery of the watch. The internal conflict intensifies as she begins questioning her own judgment, while also reaching out for validation from her close friend, Katie. Her growing paranoia and distrust lead her to become hyper-aware of James's behavior, deepening the tension in her mind. By the end of the section, it's clear that Emma will need to confront her husband, but she is uncertain about the repercussions of what she may discover. It was 7:00 p.m. when Emma stood in front of James, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The house was unnervingly quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath her feet. The day had been building to this moment, a tension so thick that it felt suffocating. She hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, hadn't been able to focus on anything but the way her life was about to change. The watch, the woman's watch, was still there, in her hand, as if it were the key to everything she needed to know. She had waited until he got home from work, the hours dragging on as she steeled herself. She had been sitting in the living room, pacing back and forth, her mind racing with every possible outcome. But now, as James entered, looking weary from his day, it all came rushing forward. This was it. She was about to ask him. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He looked up, startled, his eyes flicking between her and the watch in her hand. "What's wrong?" he asked, trying to gauge the mood in her face. There was nothing in his tone. No concern, no curiosity. Just a guarded neutrality. He was hiding something. She could see it. His avoidance of her gaze, the tightness around his lips. Don't let him avoid this, Emma. Don't let him control this moment. Her thoughts screamed at her to take the first step. She didn't give him time to speak again. She held up the watch, and his face immediately froze. His eyes flickered to the gleaming object in her hand, and for a moment, there was an unsettling stillness between them. His gaze shifted uncomfortably, and that was all the confirmation she needed. "You're not even going to pretend, are you?" she asked, her voice now firm, but laced with a sharp edge of disbelief. James opened his mouth, then closed it, as though he was considering his next move, but there was no apology in his eyes. No defense, just guilt. But he couldn't fool her anymore. "Where did you get this?" Emma demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "How long has this been going on with her?" For a moment, he looked like he might say something, anything to explain. But instead, he sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. His posture slumped, and for the first time, Emma saw the exhaustion in him. Exhaustion that was different from the tiredness that came from a long day at work. I didn't want to hurt you," he muttered, as though the words were a struggle to say, as though each syllable pained him. Emma's heart sank further, her anger bubbling up. "Hurt me? You think this is about hurt? You've been lying to me, James. For how long?" "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his eyes now locking with hers. But there was no remorse, no real apology. It was as if he was caught in the middle of something too big for him to control, and the weight of the truth was too much to carry. The air between them grew thick with tension. Emma could feel her pulse racing in her temples, the thundering heartbeat that matched her rising fury. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think clearly anymore. This was the man she had trusted with everything, and he was betraying her. He had betrayed her. "You're telling me you've been seeing someone else, and you didn't think I'd notice." She was starting to shake, her body trembling with a combination of fury and disbelief. "What else have you been hiding, James? What else?" He looked away, unable to meet her eyes, and that was all it took. He was admitting it without saying a word. Emma's world, which had once been built on trust and love, crumbled in that instant. The foundation she had believed in was nothing but a lie, a thin, fragile facade that had shattered before her eyes. "Who is she?" Emma demanded. "I deserve to know. After everything we've been through, I deserve the truth." His silence was the loudest answer. He couldn't even bring himself to say her name. Emma felt a wave of anger so fierce it almost blinded her, a kind of rage that comes not just from betrayal, but from being utterly deceived. Her throat tightened with emotion as she tried to catch her breath. Her body was on the edge of breaking. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something, anything, to make the hurt stop, but instead she stood there, rooted to the spot, as though her entire body had been frozen by the gravity of the moment. Her mind raced back to their wedding day, the vows they had made, the promises that felt so real back then. Where had it all gone wrong? Where had James gone? The man she had married felt like a stranger now, someone she didn't know anymore, someone she wasn't sure she could even love. 1,000 questions piled up in her mind, each one more painful than the last. How long had this been happening? Had he been in love with her? Had she ever been enough? "Is she the reason you've been so distant lately?" Emma asked, her voice trembling as she tried to keep it steady. Her own uncertainty made her feel vulnerable, and that only angered her more. James hesitated, the weight of her words clearly hitting him. He finally spoke, but his words felt hollow. "I'm sorry. I know I've made mistakes, but I never meant to hurt you. I still care about you." But the words didn't matter. They felt empty, like a poor excuse for something much deeper. He had betrayed her, not just physically but emotionally, and now, all he could offer her was an apology that felt like a last-ditch effort to avoid the inevitable. Emma's heart shattered. She took a step back, looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. This wasn't the man she had built her life with. This was someone else, someone she couldn't even recognize anymore. In that moment, something shifted inside Emma. The tears that had been welling up, threatening to spill over, no longer felt like an expression of weakness. They were the sign of something else, of strength. She wasn't going to let him make this decision for her. She wasn't going to let him dictate her future anymore. "I want you to leave," she said, her voice no longer trembling. It was firm, resolute. There was a sense of finality in her words, as if the years of marriage had led her to this conclusion. James stood frozen, his mouth open as though trying to form the words to fix everything. But there was nothing to say anymore. She had heard everything she needed to hear. She had seen everything she needed to see. "I said leave, James." As James moved toward the door, his footsteps heavy with regret, Emma felt a quiet strength begin to build within her. The tears still came, but now they were cleansing. For the first time in days, she was breathing again. She was freeing herself from the weight of his lies. This was no longer about him. It was about her, about reclaiming her life, her self-worth, her dignity. She had made her choice, and it was the hardest one she had ever faced. As he left, Emma stood there, the house now eerily quiet again. But this time, she wasn't alone. She was finally whole, even if it was just the beginning of the road ahead. The days following the confrontation felt like a blur, each moment heavy with the weight of a decision Emma had never thought she would have to make. She had always believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the vows she had taken. But now, the threads that had once bound her to James seemed to be unraveling faster than she could grasp them. She sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty space beside her. The silence in the house was overwhelming, almost suffocating. There was no sound of footsteps in the hallway, no sound of James's voice calling from the kitchen. It was as if the house itself had been abandoned, left to echo the absence of the man who had once been her whole world. So this is it, Emma thought, her chest tightening. The end of a marriage. The end of a life she had carefully built. But despite the hurt, despite the sense of loss that gnawed at her insides, there was also a strange sense of relief, like a weight being lifted, even if only for a moment. She ran her hands over the smooth, empty sheets, the space beside her feeling more like a chasm than a bed. She thought about James and how he had looked at her in the final moments of their conversation. The guilt, the remorse, the attempt to explain away the years of deception. But she could no longer trust the words he said. She couldn't even remember when his apologies had begun to feel empty. The phone call she had made that morning still lingered in her mind. Calling the lawyer had felt like something both terrifying and necessary. The papers had been filed, and soon she would have to face the reality of what she had set in motion. A divorce. The dissolution of everything they had built. For the first time in years, Emma stood before the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The face was the same, but the eyes. Those eyes were different. They had seen things, felt things, that had changed her forever. The woman she had been before James's betrayal seemed like a distant memory, like a younger version of herself who had been naive to the complexities of love and trust. Her fingers brushed lightly over her reflection. Who am I now? She felt a wave of self-doubt, the question hanging in the air like an accusation. Was she doing the right thing? Was this really the end of everything? She thought of the years they had spent together, the quiet moments of tenderness that now felt hollow. Were those years just a lie? Were they just as meaningless as his betrayal? Could I have done something differently? She asked herself. What if this was a mistake? What if I've thrown everything away for nothing? The questions swirled around her head like a storm, each one cutting deeper than the last. The idea of divorce, of ending everything, felt like a betrayal too. But this time, it was a betrayal of herself. She had trusted James with everything she had. She had trusted him with her heart, with her dreams. And now she was going to break everything apart, all for the sake of something that had been destroyed in an instant. But when Emma thought about the past week, When she thought about the confrontation, the doubt began to fade. She saw James's face again, the way he had stood there, defensive and unable to offer her any real answers. She remembered how her hands had trembled with the hurt, but how she had still held her ground. No, this was not a mistake. This was my truth. This was the only way. The first time Emma brought up the word divorce to James, his reaction was not what she expected. She thought, perhaps naively, that his guilt would propel him to beg her to stay, to promise that he would change. But instead, he reacted with quiet anger, the kind of anger that had once been familiar, but had faded in the years of their marriage. "I can't believe you're really going through with this," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "We can work through this, Emma. I swear, I've learned from my mistakes. I know I hurt you, but we don't have to throw everything away." His words hit her like a slap, but she wasn't as vulnerable as she had been before. She had heard the same promises before, the same false promises that he would do better, be better. But nothing had changed, and the hardest part was accepting that. He was asking her to trust him again, but trust was the one thing he had already destroyed. "I can't keep living like this, James. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when I know it's not. You betrayed me. You lied to me. I can't forgive that." His face hardened. "So that's it then. You're just going to walk away from everything. You've always been like this, Emma. So quick to give up. Always running from things when they get tough." She felt a stab of anger shoot through her chest. "I'm running. You've already walked away, James. Every time you lied to me, every time you kept secrets, you walked away. You don't get to make this about me." He was silent, his jaw clenched, but she could see the storm of emotions in his eyes. But nothing he said would change the decision that had already been made. She couldn't live in the shadow of his betrayal any longer. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, meetings with the lawyer, and the quiet hum of a life being dismantled piece by piece. Emma took solace in the small victories, signing the divorce papers, packing up her things, and reclaiming the parts of her life that had been lost in the wake of betrayal. It was difficult, yes. Painful, yes. But with every step, she could feel the pieces of herself slowly coming back together. She spent time with friends who offered support, comforting her when she needed it most. She found strength in the kindness of others, in the realization that she didn't have to face this alone. But she also spent time alone, facing the depths of her own emotions and confronting the woman she had become. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emma realized something. This was no longer just about the marriage. It was about her. It was about reclaiming the life she had lost and finding herself again. She had been strong enough to stand up for herself, strong enough to say enough was enough. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Her future was unwritten. And for the first time in years, she was ready to write her own story. The final papers were signed. It was official. Emma's marriage to James was over. The house, once a shared space of laughter, love, and quiet companionship, was now hers alone. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the last remaining remnants of their life together. The framed photo on the wall of their honeymoon, the silver wedding bands still resting on the counter where they'd always been. It felt surreal to think that the woman who had once believed in forever was now facing a future without James in it. But she wasn't angry anymore. No, the anger had faded weeks ago, replaced by something far more profound. Acceptance. As she ran her fingers over the cool surface of the countertop, she thought about how much she had changed. She had spent so many years defining herself through the lens of her marriage, through the expectations placed on her as a wife. But now, she understood that her identity was not bound by the person she had been with. It had always been hers to reclaim. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to reflect on the painful road she had traveled. The shock of the betrayal had rattled her to the core, but in the months that followed, she had learned more about herself than she ever thought possible. She had learned that she was stronger than she had given herself credit for, that no matter how deep the wound, healing was possible, and it was within her power to begin the process. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone else off the hook. It was about giving herself the peace she needed to move forward. And while she had forgiven James, the hardest part had been forgiving herself. How could I not see it? The question had plagued her for weeks, gnawing at her from the inside out. But now, as she sat alone in the quiet house, she understood. She had trusted him. And while that trust had been broken, it didn't mean she was weak. In fact, it was in her vulnerability that she had found her greatest strength. She had loved fully, without reservation. That kind of love was rare, and no one could take that from her. I was enough, she thought, and I always will be. The divorce itself had been a process, one filled with emotions that Emma had never anticipated. At first, it had felt like a blur. Lawyers, meetings, the constant reminders of everything that had led to this point. But as the days passed, she began to see it as an opportunity to redefine her life. She had sold the house, taken a break from her career, and even enrolled in a painting class, something she had always wanted to try. For the first time in years, Emma felt like she was living for herself, not for anyone else. The newness of it all was both terrifying and exhilarating. Her friends had been a constant source of support, offering kind words and practical help when she needed it most. There were nights she cried, nights she doubted her decision, but each time she reached out, they were there. Slowly but surely, Emma was rebuilding her life, one piece at a time. One Saturday afternoon, Emma stood in front of her apartment window, looking out at the city below. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden hue over everything. For the first time in a long time, she felt peaceful. There was no anger, no regret, just a sense of quiet acceptance. She could feel the stirrings of a new chapter within her, one where she no longer needed validation from anyone else. She didn't need a partner to complete her. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had already proven enough to herself. But even as she embraced this newfound freedom, Emma knew that the future wasn't so easily defined. There would be moments of doubt, moments when the scars from her past would ache. Would she ever trust again? Could she ever fully open her heart to someone else? Maybe, she thought, but not yet. I'm not ready for that. For now, the only love she needed was for herself, and that was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Emma continued her journey of self-discovery. The healing wasn't linear. There were days when the past felt fresh, when the pain of betrayal felt like it had only just happened. But she had learned how to sit with that pain, how to let it wash over her without allowing it to define her. She had learned that strength wasn't about avoiding heartbreak. It was about facing it, feeling it, and still choosing to move forward. She had learned that love was something to be cherished, but it was also something that began with loving herself first. One morning, as she walked down the street to her favorite cafe, Emma noticed the little things. The way the light filtered through the trees, the warmth of the sun on her skin. She realized that for the first time in a long time, she was no longer waiting for someone to complete her. She was whole, just as she was. This is what freedom feels like, she thought, a soft smile curling at the corners of her lips. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would ever marry again, or if she would ever trust another man the way she had trusted James. But she knew that no matter what came next, she was strong enough to handle it. And for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace.